Every voice matters. Blue Lift is a podcast dedicated to address the issues that affect all of us, with engaging discussions with progressive thought leaders and experts as guests. Here's your host, Peggy Kingsbury.
Well, everybody, welcome back to another edition of Blue Lift, and we have a real treat today. We've got a celebrity in the house. We've got David Plazas with us. I'm just glad that you all have decided to join us again and spend a little time with us on Blue Lift. I hope you're enjoying things, and keep the emails coming with guest ideas. I love those. David is the Opinion and Engagement Director for the USA Today Network newsrooms in Tennessee and the Tennessean, where he serves as an editorial writer, opinion columnist, op-ed editor, and an editorial board member. He's written nationally award-winning columns on affordable housing, government accountability, and civic engagement. He also leads the acclaimed Civility Tennessee campaign, and he curates the Latino Tennessee Voices newsletter and hosts a Tennessee Voices video podcast. It's got quite a few episodes, 400. We're not there yet with Blue Lift, and we're working on it. But I think the main thing that David does for us is he provides some pages in the Tennessean where we can read all sorts of opinions, and that's the part of the paper that I really enjoy the most. I like to see what my fellow Tennesseans have to say about things. So let's just start right off. I want to ask you a question that a lot of people have asked me when I told them I was interviewing you. How do you decide what gets on the editorial page? Is there a formula for conservative versus progressive? How does that work?
Yeah, so we're guided by 4 principles that are part of the mission. And first of all, Peggy, thank you so much for inviting me on the show. I'm delighted to be here with you. 4 principles of our editorial board policy are: we stand for the First Amendment, we defend the Amendment, freedom of the press, of course, and the freedom to exchange ideas. We stand for civility, which civility really has become more and more defined over the years. It used to be just something nice to do, but it really is about the citizen's role in challenging society, upholding society, and also creating greater connections with each other. We amplify underrepresented viewpoints. For the Tennessean, historically, that would mean a lot of conservative voices, underrepresented voices such as communities of color. And finally, we welcome diverse voices. We want to see a whole range of voices there. And sometimes they can push the envelope, but we are very careful about not wanting to dehumanize anybody as we allow these to be discussed. But we do believe that a robust exchange of ideas and a passionate exchange of ideas is really for our readers.
Great. That's interesting. So that gives us sort of an idea of how the selections are made. I will tell you that one time years ago, and I can't remember the exact year, it was in the early 2000s, I wrote a letter to the Tennessean, and it was a 3-star letter. So people who've been around a while know that if you wrote a letter to the Tennessean and it was really liked by I don't know who, it would get 3 stars. And then at the end of the year, whatever they decided the end of the year was, then all of the 3-star letter writers were invited to a dinner. And my letter, I don't know how long you've been in Nashville, but my letter was actually, I need to pull that back out and send it back in actually, but my letter was about Kid Rock. And he had gotten into some trouble in Nashville, and quite frankly showed his butt. And so I was having a bit of a to go with the Nashville police. And I'm a former police officer and I have a master's in criminal justice. So it really struck me what happened. And I wrote the letter and got 3 stars for it. So that's my claim to fame.
Congratulations. The 3-star letter, I've been here for a little over 10 years, and the 3-star letter preceded me. So it already had been over a few years before I had arrived. I've heard a lot from people who enjoyed that so much. And letters to the editor are still among the best read content that we have. And interestingly enough, you mentioned I've written about Kid Rock was attacked by I think all his fans back in 2018 when he insulted one of the members of you. I said that he shouldn't be Grand Marshal of the National Parade. And did I hear my weekend was completely ruined by social media and elsewhere by people who were defending him. And last year, my big celebrity op-ed or column was all about Morgan Wallen and I remember he threw a chair off a honky tonk of Chiefs, which is Eric Church's honky tonk. I believe it was maybe in March or April of 2024. And I wrote a piece just talking about, this is a public safety issue. So it's not just about the celebrity, but about the whole notion of having consideration for others. It was one of the most read of the year.
Yeah, yeah, I can see that. That's I guess one of the interesting things about Nashville. We're never short of celebrities who are here, and I live in Williamson County, and it seems that if they're going to drive while under the influence, they tend to do that around Franklin for some reason, and it makes the news. So yeah, we have plenty of that going on. I had as a guest a couple of weeks ago, and I'm not sure her segment's come out yet, or yeah, I think it has. I had Deb Fisher with us, who I'm sure that you know, and we talked some about the First Amendment and about issues around that. So hearing you talk about the editorial mix was interesting. Let's talk about your feelings regarding trust in journalism, and I know that's a huge topic right now. But there are so many people now who don't trust anything they read or see of the news. How are news organizations like yours dealing with that level of distrust?
Yeah, it's a real issue. It's a problem that has multiple reasons to it. On the one hand, social media and echo chambers. On the other hand, the idea that people feel underrepresented in their news sources, and also a lot of the disinformation regarding how legacy media is out to get certain people. But we've also not done a good job of going out to places such as rural areas, which I have been doing for several years now, of going out and meeting people, especially in civic groups, to explain what we do. We need to do a better job of explaining why we do what we do as journalists. So, for example, back in 2018, we had officially launched the Civility Tennessee project, and I was invited to go to McMinnville, Tennessee, to the Rotary Club there. McMinnville's about 80 miles east of Nashville. Beautiful community, about 14,000 people, but very civically engaged. And after I finished my remarks for about 10 minutes, the first question I was asked was, "Why should we trust you?" And that question, I have it on a picture that's in my office. That reminds me every day that that's something we have to be able to answer. And part of the solution, I think, is to be present where people are, to be respectful, and also to explain what we do. Some of one of the reasons why the gentleman asked that question to me was because he was convinced that there was a media conspiracy to elect Hillary Clinton in 2016. And he's like, look at what the polling said, and it didn't happen, and you're looking down on us. And I realized that this was a moment, an aha moment for me to say, we've got to invest, and this just can't be a fly in and fly out. So since that meeting, I've been to McMinnville 7 times in the last 7 years, coming to moderate events, going to community meetings, because I think it's important. It matters for us to be present. And I've worked with different national organizations, from the American Press Institute to Trusting News, that have given us some tools and tips. For example, with the American Press Institute, we did a change of how we covered communities of color. Initially, we would tell stories about communities of color, and we said we got to change that paradigm, tell stories for, with, and by them. And thus, Black and Latino Tennessee Voices initiatives started back in 2020 and then 2021 after that, with live storytelling events, newsletters that have become fundamental to our journalism. That it's not just about us telling stories, but about us using our platform to amplify voices. And much like you wrote your 3-star letter, facilitating people to be able to tell their own stories and provide their own ideas.
Mm-hmm. Good. That's interesting. And I do think that that's super important to, we sometimes get in our bubble and we think the whole world is the little area that we live in. And so it's really important to remember that the Tennessean is the main paper for Middle Tennessee, which includes big cities and small towns and everything in between. A while back, you wrote an essay about reinventing journalism to strengthen democracy. And you wrote that before we were in arguably a constitutional crisis. Now, I know that that's a topic you've been hot on the last week or so, as have many people. But when you talk about reinventing journalism to strengthen democracy, tell us all a little bit about that, how you think that can work. Is it working? Does it need to be reinvented? How can journalism help strengthen democracy?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I mentioned McMinnville extensively in that essay. And I had been there at that moment 3 or 4 times. I think it was a few years ago that it came out. And a lot of it is about being present, because oftentimes people have impressions of journalists because they don't know them. A study from American Press Institute Pew Research Center also did this, showed that only about 20% of Americans have ever met a journalist. So the first thing is we have to show up and we have to be present and explain what we do. Oftentimes there's a lot of mystery. It's almost like a conclave, a people conclave of sorts, and it shouldn't be. We should be able to explain why we made a particular editorial decision. So, for example, when I came to the Tennessean, I asked our editorial board if I could sign editorials. And that wasn't a practice that was done beforehand. And it's been a long practice to have unsigned editorials. But the reason is this, is we're in a different era today. It's not like before where people, we're okay with having this group, explain the position of the newspaper. People also wanted to know why we did it. And I remember I got this call years ago from someone who said, who's the idiot who wrote this editorial? Well, now they know exactly who the idiot is. And my number is in the paper, my email's in the paper, and we can actually discuss what the issues are. Why did we do this? And even if someone disagrees with me, we can at least come to some resolution. So, for example, you talked about constitutional crisis. I just wrote a column a few days ago about that particular subject, and my position was this: is that I doesn't mean anything, that term, to me anymore, because we're hearing from legal experts either we're in a constitutional crisis or we're about to get into a constitutional crisis. Let's call it what it is. I reread my Constitution over a recent weekend, and the fact is that or at least in my view, based upon the facts in the Constitution, the executive branch is overreaching its authority. And, that is a violation of the Constitution, not just a crisis. And this is something that needs to be contained. Now, I've received a lot of feedback, both pro and con. And one of them from a critic who I engage with regularly said, well, Democrats and progressives are always talking about a crisis, that you'll be like Chicken Little, and eventually nobody's going to, believe you when there actually is a crisis. And, we started this exchange back and forth and ended very amicably, where we both agreed that we should be rereading our founding documents, including the Federalist Papers and others, just to remember, why is it that people are feeling the way they are? Why is it the executive, governing through executive orders when Congress is the one that makes laws? And the reality is that there's something broken there. The fact that there's not this balance at this moment, and it's generating a lot of feedback. We put out a survey after my column ran, and we're starting to get some results that will be presenting the week of the first week of April. And my hope is that we'll have some good, robust conversation about that.
Oh, that's interesting. There's been a lot of talk in my circles about constitutional crisis. And what I hear a lot of people say is, okay, first of all, how low is the bar going to go before we admit that's where we are? And secondly, then what? If we admit we're in a constitutional crisis, which means that, in my mind, we're saying, okay, the Constitution was set up the way it is for very obvious reasons and clear reasons, and now we're seeing that completely changed. What happens if we say we're in a constitutional crisis? And I think a lot of people are rolling their eyes at that phrase, constitutional crisis, now, because there doesn't seem to be anything to do if we are in one. So a lot of people I know are saying, so what? That's sort of scary, isn't it?
It's a great point, because that's the thing. That's the thought that I had as well. What happens next? And at this moment, we're seeing things play out as they should. There's supposed to be friction in democracy and in our republic. The executive, legislative, and judicial branches are constantly at loggerheads. Currently the judicial branch, for the most part, has ruled against the executive at this moment, and we'll see it through. The problem is that the executive operates at a speed that the judicial branch cannot operate at. The legislative branch is going along with what the executive wants, at least the majority of people are. And so, and there are other methods as well. When I talk about, people have heard about the fourth estate, being the press, but there's also the people, when it comes to activism, when it comes to speaking up, letting your voice be heard. That's incredibly important. One of the difficult things for me in doing my job is that the amount of disinformation that comes out, some folks are saying the sky is blue or the sky is red, or we even take the signal scandal, with regard to top officials, including the vice president and secretary of defense, who are trying to spin, allowing a journalist to be on a discussion about war plans. I mean, that's horrifying. And, these are things they're trying to basically downplay, when in fact, this is incredibly serious. And part of the public pressure is people like yourself, people like me, people in our community coming out and saying, this is not right. And, years ago, at least in the first Trump term, I remember people talking about norms being violated. But the question is, what really are those norms anymore? We've seen a lot of this stuff implode, explode. There's a lot of confusion. That's why people tend to tune out, because they're like, well, just I'm going to sleep for the next 4 years and then see what happens. Well, that's not an answer. That will put us in a crisis if we're not awake, if we're not present in our society, speaking up, voting in school board elections or county commission and city council elections, where those are the most important, in my view, for the average citizen. You run into your local officials at the grocery store or at your congregation or at the park, and they're people who can really have a big influence on your lives. So one big issue that's affecting Middle Tennessee at this moment is the issue of growth. It's probably the biggest issue at this moment. How do we grow sustainably? How do we keep housing affordable for folks where we know there's a dearth of affordability for most people's budgets? And how do we maintain farmland in rural areas? Because about 90% of Tennessee is rural, and a lot of people like the rural nature of where they live.
Right.
And so these things that need to be balanced are incredibly important, and there are decisions that have to be made. And so oftentimes, yes, the winning side will get to have its say, but they can't do so extra legally or unconstitutionally.
Yeah. Yeah. Those are good points. And I think rereading some of those original documents is a good idea. And it has occurred to me that, the way the Supreme Court is stacked right now, we will see, I think, some eroding of some of the things that were in the original document. They will be changed and eroded a bit. And I suppose that some people don't have a problem with that. But I'm not sure that we respect as much as we should the intent of that document, the Constitution. I'm not sure that we have the amount of respect for that we used to have. I want to switch gears a little bit, and you had mentioned just a few minutes ago that you wanted your name on the editorials, and I love that. And so it goes along with sort of my next line of questioning. When we come to situations, and I've served as the chair of the Democratic Party in Williamson County, and that time is almost up. We're having our reorganization in a couple of weeks, and it will not make the news like the Williamson County Republican reorganization, by the way. So don't worry about that. And I do live in Williamson County, and we provide the Tennessean plenty of fodder for news. So you're welcome. But when I serve as the person who I come to the role in. I'm in my skin, I'm in my body, I'm in all the things that have happened to me. And when you serve in your role, you are bringing what I think is an incredibly interesting background. I mean, David Plazas is so many things wrapped up into one. I know that you are, I believe, you're a first generation American in your family. Is that correct? And your parents were from Puerto Rico?
From Colombia and Cuba.
Colombia
my dad from Colombia, my mom from Cuba.
Okay. I don't know why I said Puerto Rico. That's obviously part of the United States. I needed geography lessons. I'm still confused. We're renaming things now, David, and it's hard for me to keep up. Renaming and annexing. I can't keep up with all of it. So that's an interesting aspect to who you are. And I know that your dad was a Catholic priest who fell in love and became an Episcopal priest. And I know that you are part of the LGBTQ community. So, you bring these things to your role. And how does that inform your journalism, who you are and your experiences in life? How does that inform your journalism?
It's a wonderful question, because when I was a young reporter, initially I was not out of the closet. A lot of it was I grew up in a very conservative Christian household, and was very concerned back 25 years ago when I started of whether or not it would dampen my career mobility, because we didn't know. Today, I would say I can't regret what happened then, but I can observe that it was okay. It was actually better. I think I became a better journalist when I came out. I think I became a better journalist when I was very open about, my background, because my goal is not to tell people that you have to accept me or believe what I think, but I think it provides some empathy for understanding that people have different experiences they bring to it. I try to be very empathetic. I try to listen, because my parents are immigrants. I know that there are challenges when it comes to people being able to learn English right away. My parents are fluent in English, but my grandparents were not, and it's not that easy when you have to work all day to be also studying English at the same time. So you get to get that perspective. And at the same time, it allows me to really listen in when people are of other backgrounds. We have a large immigrant community in the Nashville area. We have the largest contingent of people who are Kurdish descent outside of Kurdistan here, and a growing Latino community. And at the same time, I want to understand too the nuances of longtime Tennesseans who've been here. Governor Lee is a seventh generation Tennessean. I've had the opportunity to meet lawmakers who are very conservative and may have different viewpoints about me and my sexual orientation, but who've always acted, at least publicly, at least courteous, even if I have tremendous disagreements of certain pieces of legislation that are out there. And I'm in a capacity to speak out against them. And when I've talked to people about, bringing balance, let's say if you're talking about something related to the LGBTQ community, I think one of the things that's important is to hear multiple viewpoints when it comes to policy. Now, when it comes to dehumanizing something, that's something that we take great value. Part of our values as a Tennessean is to respect people's views. We think back to the great John Sigenthaler, who was a hero of of promoting civil rights and a hero in journalism, who talked about that you are there to serve the people and serve the average person, and it's a reminder for us all.
Mm-hmm. And that's interesting. And when you arrived in Tennessee, you brought all of those life experiences with you. How do you see Tennessee news shaping up now in light of all of the things that you are? And I'm asking this question because I cannot imagine sitting at an editorial desk and all of the things that must be coming at you right now. For me, they would cause me to want to react and perhaps to feel some pain because immigrants are being talked about and dehumanized. Gay people are being talked about and dehumanized. It seems like the arrows are just coming from everywhere at marginalized communities and marginalized peoples. Just talk to me about how that feels and how you sort of have to sift through that to make sure that there's a little David Plazas in what you're writing, but not so much that it's personal.
Yeah, I was at a conference last year in Los Angeles on a panel, and I was asked this question by someone, "What are you still doing in Tennessee?" And they were referring to the anti-LGBTQ legislation. And my response, I knew what I was going to say because I've been asked this before. And I said, my response is that there are many stories to tell, and I have a platform to help people tell those stories. And I believe that there's a responsibility to use that in a very serious way. I'm honored to live here. I love living in Nashville, and I love the people-to-people connection. And people generally, for the most part, one-on-one, when they're outside of social media, when they're outside of some heated environment, they tend to be pretty decent. And one of the main things we need to do as average citizens is to speak up and assert our place in society. So it's amazing when I see, for example, immigrants coming out to the legislature and saying that they're not going to be disrespected. I mean, there's a proposal, a bill at this moment that would allow schools to deny entry to undocumented immigrants. The legislative leaders know that it wouldn't go into effect unless there's a change at the Supreme Court, but it still would create the possibility, if the court decides otherwise, to overturn its decision of the 1980s, that little kids are going to be caught in the crossfire of politics. And that's not right. I wish it were different, and we'll continue speaking out. I have a pretty open relationship with a lot of staff offices of members of the legislature and members of Congress, and we certainly want their views to come out there, but we want to talk about real policy issues. So it can be challenging, but I will tell you that being from Chicago, it wasn't that easy either. I mean, I remember as a kid, the first Black mayor of Chicago, Harold Washington, was elected in 1983. There was tremendous amounts of racism that he faced. Groups, Democrats, who did not want him to succeed. And it took him years to finally put in place, and he died in office in 87. But it was an example as a young boy, and I was very politically minded and read the newspaper from the time I was 5. So I was a big nerd, when it came to those things. But it just made me sad, and it realized that this is not something that is endemic to Tennessee or the South. I mean, this is racism, the different phobias. They're all over the place, and oftentimes it takes exposure. I do remember several years ago, this was maybe in 2015 or 2016, there was a former state representative from Wilson County. His name escapes me right now, but he initially was behind some of the anti-trans legislation. And the reason he changed his mind was because he started talking to people who were intersex and realized that gender is not as, binary as currently the debate suggests. You can say that there are two genders, but that would be denying some basic biology. And we know, for example, that not everybody is born the same. Most people are XX and XY, but there are certain exceptions, and they're humans who deserve to be treated like humans. So everybody's story is very different. I mean, I remember when I first met fellow trans journalists back in 2004, and I'd never met somebody who was who was openly trans, and just taking a moment to say, what am I? And I wasn't fearful, but I just didn't know. I was ignorant. And so, but just taking the time to sit down with two people, one who continues to be a very good friend, was like, you are just a human like me. And one thing I would advise, I'm a lot more patient today than I was in my 20s. I was much more impulsive, but a lot of it is, take that time to have the conversation, because it's amazing what you'll find out. And sometimes it'll surprise you, even with people who are radically different than you are. You can have the opportunity to have those differences, which can sometimes be very difficult, because we tend to sort ourselves out as Americans. We're out there, want to live with people who think like us, who vote like us. And our biggest problem, in my belief, is that we collectively don't want to live with people who have different incomes than us. We want to be at a place where we're not having to see other. And that can be designated by race, but oftentimes it's economics. And that's something that we really have to get over, especially if we want to solve some of these problems that relate to basic quality of life that are so important.
Those are really good points. And living in the county I live in, I certainly see, what you're saying about the economics of things, because I live in a county that's very wealthy, and I'm not necessarily in that group, but I also am willing to say that, I'm very fortunate, and I understand that, but we do have a large segment of our population that does not want to see any hint that there is any economic deficit anywhere. And so affordable housing is always a big topic in Williamson County. And I, when you spoke briefly about the legislation to allow schools to turn immigrant children away, I believe that bill has been amended to also say, or they can charge them to go to school, which is, basically the same thing as turning them away. I feel like there is a movement in Tennessee to get that bill passed and to find just one county school board who will go along with it, so that the whole thing can get to the Supreme Court. And then, my personal opinion is that some people want that to happen so their name can be tied with a history-making case at the Supreme Court.
There's a good, and I'm sorry, there's a good parallel to be made with the drag ban, that was passed a few years ago, which basically would deny or make it unlawful for minors to be present in a drag show. And the group in Memphis sued, won in the first round, but then was turned back in the appeals court level, and the Supreme Court decided not to take the case. And it came down to standing, because nobody had yet been arrested for this particular crime. The law now stands. So it just takes one plaintiff to have some kind of standing that could have some very difficult to change legal setup that may affect a lot of people.
Right. And we may have to get back together in 6 months or so, because my personal fear is that because of the sponsors of this bill, that my home county could be the one that becomes the test county. And I really, really don't want to see that happen, because we're talking about children. And I also fear that a lot of immigrant parents now are just not sending their kids to school because they're afraid to, and that's not healthy for society either, at all.
No, I mean, it's one of those things that we truly believe in public safety. Education is one of the best ways to prevent crime. And so this is, to me, I realize that the legislative leaders are making a point. And the reason I know this is I moderated a panel at the Tennessee Press Association where I saw Deb Fisher, and the panel was made up of House Speaker Cameron Sexton and Senate Majority Leader Jack Johnson, who represents Williamson County. And they were very blatant about the fact that this is about having a test case where they can ask the court to revisit its earlier decision from 40 plus years ago.
Yeah, that's pretty sad. Kind of switching gears again, I've seen a pattern happen in the news lately that is pretty obvious, but maybe it's just the way I'm looking at it, so I'm asking an expert about it. It seems that two things happen. One is if someone is going to do something really bad, like if the administration is going to do something really bad, not as though I don't think they do something really bad every day, but let's just say this is extremely bad, it'll happen on a Friday afternoon because less people are less clued into the news over the weekend, and they hope the dust can kind of settle by Monday. And when something happens that is going to be like a huge headline in the Tennessean, for example, there may be a shiny thing somewhere else. And someone does something else to deflect that big news story. And we see that, or at least I see it, and it gets to be pretty obvious. You can sort of see when something big has happened, something maybe really negative about, say, a legislator or something in Nashville has happened, and then they'll throw another shiny thing off so that all of a sudden that headline now doesn't get as much ink as it would have. How does the newsroom decide how long to keep a story in the news, a hot story like that, and how much press to give it? How does that work?
Sure. So our newsroom is made up of about, I believe it's 60 to 65 members of the newsroom. You have editors, you have reporters. Those reporters report up to those editors, and they make decisions on coverage. Now, when I started 25 years ago, we were thinking about daily print deadlines. When you talk about ink, you make me excited because that's how I started my career. But today it's much different. The majority of our work is digital. And so there's the capacity to be able to tell multiple stories on the same day, have multiple headlines. The one disadvantage, of course, is that it can become a fire hose of information so that people can't keep up or they lose interest. We know that there's an attention span problem in America. A Time op-ed from, I believe it was maybe 12 or 13 years ago, said that Americans have an attention span of 15 seconds when it comes to a news story online. And typically that's someone who's reading a headline and maybe scanning, the first or second paragraph. And a lot of times that's what we do, right? Our habits are, we look at something quickly. If it's not that interesting, we'll move on to something else. And so the goal is, how do we keep people's attention focused? And we know that not everybody has the same types of habits. We have a very large engaged sports audience. We have a very large engaged music audience. And so we have teams that cover those particular topics, which becomes pretty exciting, I think, in many ways, because then you can connect with people in different ways. And then, one thing that we've done that you may have noticed in the last year or so is that we have a team that focuses on trending stories. So it might be something like, what's the weather going to be like? As much as you could say, well, can't you Google that? If you're going to Google that, you're not going to be on our site. We'd rather you get the information from us. And where we have an advantage is that we are your local news source, and not just the Tennessean, but any local news site that wants to work that way. And we should have a deep connection with the community where we can tell you about what happened at the Nashville Metro Council, but we can also tell you that you should probably bring an umbrella to the concert this weekend. So this is all about, the issues of living an engaged life. I will tell you that one thing that I trained a group of journalists just a couple of weeks ago on the issue of navigating hostile environments. And I'm not just talking about the political environment at the moment. For those of us who've been in this career for a long time, we've been through Trump term before. Obviously, there's many different things about the second round, but there's some basic things that we know from the last time that have continued to be true, which is why it's incumbent upon us as journalists, as citizens, to develop a mindset where we can navigate a very difficult environment. Because ultimately, we could be constantly down. We could be constantly just absolutely agonizing and doom scrolling. But that's not helpful. That's not good for your anxiety. It's not good for your mental health. And one very critical part is to be very intentional about your news diet, and so that you can explain to people, if something is happening. One thing actually, initially it could have been an annoyance, but it's actually become an honor now. When I have a friend who sends me something on Instagram and says, "Is this true?" I'm like, I should check it out probably, because if my friend is talking about it, and I'd rather they get the information correct, that I've done some research behind it. And so I can tell them, yes, no, I'm not sure. Here's what I do know. And I think that's very important. Oftentimes in this digital world, we're not always willing to say, can you give me a moment to find out? or I'm not completely sure. Let's try to discover it. The other part of that about being an engaged citizen is learning when to disengage. It is very important, I think, for us to have moments of peace where we guard our peace, because that's the only way that we get up every day in the morning to recharge ourselves. If you are on fumes, I have, my therapist often talks about a gas stove, and we cannot be those people who are very busy like yourselves or me. We can't be on high flame all the time. Our bodies just can't handle it. We think we can, but the reality is our body has different answers to us, especially as we get older. And I certainly know that as someone who's a runner and who's had several injuries, you have to treat your body much better than you did when you were a younger person. And so it's really important to find those moments. And what the way that I do, I talk about this being community building. So community building isn't just going out to a town to moderate at a Rotary event. It's about going to brunch or going to lunch with your friends, about spending quality time with them and being extremely present, of not having to check your phone every 2 seconds, instead of being present in that conversation. And it is amazingly healing, in my opinion.
I agree. I play pickleball, and I hurt myself a little bit last week, and I think it's because my mind was so full of all the negativity that I was, sort of taking it out on the pickleball court, and I was trying to do things like a 40-year-old, and I'm not a 40-year-old. So, yeah. So my mind is, but my body's not for sure. You mentioned spending time with friends, and I agree. I think that's super, super important. My last guest spoke about something, and I'm just surprised at how many guests I've had who say something similar. They say that their friendships have changed because of the news, because of views, because of ideas that I think, my opinion is that that we have a segment of our population that have felt, I'll just be blunt and say it. It's my podcast. I can pretty much say what I want. I think we have a segment of our population that have been racist or bigots, and they've kept it under wraps because it's just not a nice thing to do and people don't want to hear about it. However, we're in an atmosphere now where it's just not as frowned upon as it used to be. And I also believe that the polarization of politics has really changed friendships. Does your job and the things that you have to do in your job and the editorials you write, does that affect your friendships in ways that you find bothersome sometimes?
I will tell you that in line with the work that we did with Civility Tennessee, it in many ways prepared me for where we are today. And it was a lot of hard work. And the reason I mention that is when I started this initiative, it wasn't just me. My editor came up to me and said, we should really do this. We had a lot of success from this year-long series on affordable housing, our documentary and community forums. And he said, can we do the same thing for civility? And my first reaction was, who wants civility at this time? This is the first year of the first Trump administration. And he really challenged me to get out of my comfort zone because I knew that it was going to be costly in some ways. Some people would say, well, you've gone soft, or, you can't be civil, and you shouldn't be cavorting with the other side. You shouldn't give a platform to someone who I disagree with, all that other stuff. And the reality is over the last several years, it's provided me a tremendous discipline to understand that you have to learn to be discerning and learn to be open. And obviously, it's not about accepting racism or accepting different types of phobias, or saying nothing when someone speaks up in a way that's very harmful, but rather it's a way of doing it constructively. Because I think my experience is that most people do seek to understand. Most people, just want to have a good quality of life, and fear drives a lot of bad decisions sometimes, and a lot of rush decisions. Fear drives opportunity when it comes to politics. So you get a lot of this legislation that if you hear someone say, well, it's for the children, or we're here to protect the children. We just spoke about the schools bill that's out there, which is so ironic, but we have to really be mindful of creating these daily disciplines that keep us going. Because for example, after the November election, I had several friends who said, we're not looking at the news ever again. Now they're my friends regardless. I'm not here to say you have to subscribe to the Tennessean, even though that would be great, but I don't check on them for that. But I basically told them, essentially that I'm not going to inundate you, but I have to do what I have to do. And so I've gotten this really interesting amount of feedback that has been generally positive, but it's usually it's kind of like shaking their heads, like, I don't know how you do what you do. And I said, I do it because it's a calling that I have. It's my mission. And I know that it comes with an incredible amount of stress, but also an incredible amount of opportunity and joy. Um, I had a feeling that we would be in the political environment that we're in, that Trump would win a few months ago. I mean, before during debate night. And the reason is this: I followed economic data for decades. And on debate night, when Vice President Harris wouldn't answer the question, are Americans better off today than they were 4 years ago? It really was a moment where I had this feeling that,
Mm.
you're not dealing with the issue that Americans are dealing with right now. They're in pain. They need someone like Bill Clinton said to say, I feel your pain. And here's how we're getting through this. And instead they got policy points. And people laughed at Trump for saying all the outlandish stuff about the, people eating the pets and the cats and the dogs in Springfield, Ohio. But he's always been outlandish. In this case, people were looking for someone to help empathize with them and tell them it's going to be okay, and here's what I'm going to do. And it wasn't there. So that to me, that's I started working out very hard, working on myself. Really thinking that I've got to prepare. This is going to happen, and I better be mentally prepared if I'm going to continue to do the work I'm doing.
Oh, wow. That's very interesting. I I think you're right. I think that people have gotten used to the outlandish things that he says. But like you, I see things in more of a geopolitical type way. And so I see the leader of the free world saying outlandish things now on an international stage about our allies. And I can see that while that may not seem as though it's going to affect the person who's, working in the factory, trying to make sure their rent's paid on time. Maybe they need tires for their car and that's hard to afford. And oh no, the grocery prices went up and, and I feel a lot for that person, but I find it scary that those everyone like that, and that's all of us basically, may not see the importance of the words that are uttered from the Oval Office. But in a geopolitical sense, in a year, it could be very, very harmful to us and to our democracy and to our Constitution and to our safe way of life that we've just become so used to. And the last topic I want to discuss, because I know you're a busy man and I appreciate you spending some time with us, is the effect of AI in journalism. And I have a question that has always sort of been a question on my mind. When you get a letter to the editor, if you can tell that it's AI generated, do you print that anyway, dismiss it, or do you put a note on it? How does that work for editorials?
Sure. No, we want letters to be and op-eds to be originally written. As far as I can tell, we've not had a ChatGPT or other AI letters submitted. And if I have any doubts, I'll call the person who's written the letter.
Mm.
So before a letter is run, we know who the person is, what their address is, what their numbers. We obviously don't publish that information, but it allows me, for example, the day that we're recording today, I received a letter related to PEPFAR, which is the international program that helps provide HIV and AIDS drugs to people across the world, especially in Africa. And it's signed by a whole bunch of celebrities. And I was like, okay, this is nice. I hope it is real. So I called the person and we had a long conversation. We talked through the issues, and I feel very confident now that publishing it will actually be a very important thing to do. At the same time, when it comes to AI, artificial intelligence is a tool. Some people have thought that it's going to be the thing that dooms us all, and obviously we should be wary of any new tool. But I think in many ways it can also help with issues of process. I've used AI, for example, to transcribe recordings. It used to be years ago I had to personally type what people said, and that took a long, long, long time. Imagine if you have an app that will now transcribe that conversation in 5 minutes. It allows you to focus on the writing, allows you to focus on the work. So one should always be weary and have a open eyes, but also see the possibilities of how these tools can actually enhance our community well-being. We had to be careful, of course. Social media was seen initially as the place where everybody goes to build community, and in some cases, there's a lot of nice things. I mean, you get to see people's family pictures, their experiences. I still like that, but people can also be very nasty.
Oh yeah.
And one of the things that always confused me a little bit was I would have someone be very mean to me on somewhere like X, formerly Twitter, and then in public they'd be nice so nice. And I'd just be like, I have always had the philosophy that you're going to get the same person on social media as you get if you see me in the grocery store. Like I don't have time to invent a personality for social media. But again, it's a place where people's passions get the best of them.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's people are given some courage behind a keyboard, but seeing you face to face is a completely different thing. Last question: who would you just love to interview that you hadn't been able to talk to yet?
Wow, who would I like to interview? I think one of the people who's just top of mind that I'd love to learn more about, among the many people who would be on my mind to interview, but someone like Bono, the
Hmm.
U2 star, who is such an interesting personality because he's not just a musician, he's an activist and he's a humanitarian, and really trying to find out more about his drive. One of the things that this week that we're recording, this is the 5-year anniversary of the Tennessee Voices video podcast, and I just finished episode 444. And one of the
Wow.
things that keeps me doing the show is that I learn so much from every single guest about their actions, their wisdom, and they often will talk very openly about their failures and how they were able to get up from that and learn. And so I always find it fascinating to learn people's backstories and whether they're famous or not.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, he would be a really great interview. I've seen a couple of interviews with him, but you're right. There's a depth to him, and the way he's used his fame and his fortune to affect
Mhm.
change, which I really respect that. Um, and I respect you and for what you're doing because your job is not easy. You're right. There's a fire hose of information coming at us, and it's. I'm so glad to hear that you're also, protecting yourself some from some of that because I think a lot of good people are going to burn out. And I've seen some people who I've known in the past who were in journalism who just had enough and they just couldn't do it anymore. So thank you for sticking around and for loving on us. And.
I so appreciate this. And one thing I'll say as a tip that has helped me is that every day, every morning, having me time, meditation time, even if it's just 5 minutes. And at the end of the day, I try to get a 10 to 15-minute walk in a park. And it really is incredibly cathartic and helps recharge my batteries.
I love that. We're big outdoors people, and I practice the nature bathing, that they call it in some of the Asian countries. I love that because it is. I do when I get out on the trail, whether it's Radnor or the many trails around here. I do feel like I've been, my soul's been cleansed a little bit. I love even the sound of the crunch when when you're walking on the trail. It's very therapeutic for me. So, well, thank you very much, David Plazas. I hope that we will stop providing a lot of news for the Tennessean out of Williamson County, but I suspect that's not going to change much because we've still got a school board. So there you go. We appreciate your time, and I appreciate all the listeners on Blue Lift. If you've loved the show, let me know. If you don't like the show, well, let me know that too. If you have a great guest idea, I'd love to do that. And like David, I am certainly welcoming to all sorts of viewpoints on Blue Lift, and we've had some of that, and we're going to have more of that moving forward because we say here at Blue Lift, every voice matters, and I truly believe that. Thanks, David.
Thank you for what you do. This is an honor.